Hello and welcome to today's media briefing from the Port of Los Angeles. I'm Philip Sanfield, the Port's Communications Director, and as always, I'm joined by Executive Director Gene Seroka. Great to be with you, Gene.
Thank you, Philip. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and the media joining us from near and far. I'm looking forward to today sharing the latest updates with everyone that's joined. Once again, it's been a very busy month with respect to tariffs, trade policy, and the supply chain. We'll begin by looking at how those factors impacted cargo volume right here in Los Angeles. After that, we'll welcome our special guest, Ernie Tedeschi, the Director of Economics with the Budget Lab at Yale, a nonpartisan policy research center. Ernie and the Budget Lab have been conducting a detailed analysis on the effect of tariffs on consumers, jobs, and the economy. I'm looking forward to Ernie's perspective on these complex issues. Then, once again, we'll set aside extra time to address your questions.
Thank you, Gene. Let's begin with our May cargo volume. Please walk us through that data.
Philip, in May, the Port of Los Angeles processed 717,000 container units. That's about 5% less than last year at this time, which is just a little better than we expected. However, a closer look at the data shows that May imports fell by 9% from last year and 19% compared to the month of April. Inbound cargo totaled 356,000 20-foot equivalent units, which was 25% less than what we forecasted on April 1 before the tariffs were announced. For context, we typically expect May volume to be a little stronger than that of April because we're approaching peak season. And compared to our 5-year running average for the month of May, imports are down 17%. Moving over to exports, we handled 120,000 units, a 5% decrease from 2024. That lands us at 6 straight months of declining exports, much of that at the expense of American farmers. Next week, I'll be in Tacoma, Washington for the 37th Annual Agriculture Transportation Coalition Conference, the largest gathering of its kind. Led by AgTC's Peter Friedman, we'll strategize on actionable steps, both on the ground and in Washington, D.C., to turn the tide and begin boosting U.S. exports. Meanwhile, we sent 240,000 empty containers back across the Pacific, which is about the same amount as last year. The bottom line, May marked our lowest monthly volume in over 2 years. While we're tracking 4% of last year's volume year to date, I expect overall cargo flow to remain modest for the balance of 2025. Further, released just this week, the National Retail Federation's Port Tracker predicts a decline in imports for each month, June, July, and August coming ahead. To give you some perspective, the last 6 months of 2024, here at the Port of Los Angeles, we averaged 927,000 container units each month. We simply don't see those kind of numbers unless there's significant change to trade policy very soon.
Thanks, Gene. Before we bring on our guests, could you please share your take on this week's tariff developments with China and how trade policy is impacting the economy?
Sure, Philip. Well, it's promising that the two sides were talking again with those meetings in London. What we saw was a tentative framework that's not close to a final agreement, and it basically takes us back to the result of the discussions in Geneva earlier in May. Tariffs remain elevated. On average, due to the cumulative effect, imports from China to the United States are at 55% tariffs. Conversely, 10% tariffs in a retaliatory fashion have been placed on all U.S. exports. There's much more work to be done here. This likely won't move the needle for many businesses. What I continue to hear is we want clarity, longer range planning capability, and much lower tariffs. I see this through 3 key lenses: consumers, business, and labor. Starting off with consumers, As a leading economic indicator here in the United States, we see activity up to 3 months before products hit the ground here in Los Angeles and are distributed throughout the country. And it's very slow here. Seasonally, we've already blown past summer fashion and looking forward now to back to school and Halloween before the all-important year-end holidays. That cargo for those micro seasons needs to be here on the ground right now. I don't necessarily see that in inventory levels. We'll likely see higher prices and fewer selections for both that back to school and Halloween season. And those products right now will give us a little bit less than we normally would see as far as cargo volume coming across our docks. On the business side, many continue to tell me that they've paused on hiring, capital investments, and overall strategic supply chain initiatives. The year-end holiday cycle usually sees purchase orders going into Asia factories during the month of May. Maybe we could lead into June, but absolutely the full stop date of July 1 is fast approaching. I was just in Detroit at the invitation of Jim Lemon and the Expeditors International folks for their annual automotive conference. And what I heard from both the OEMs and tiered suppliers is that they continue with a steady but low-level flow of parts and components to keep those factories moving. Auto sales are not at their peak right now, and at this point in time, the choice between paying higher tariffs in that sector and shutting a line down at an auto plant is a no-brainer for many. A line closure could mean $2 to $5 million per hour in lost investment. And then on the side of small to medium-sized businesses, they're really feeling the financial pinch. Paying tariffs up front for seasonal products or to keep their businesses running day to day has many dipping into their cash reserves. And at point of sale some months down the road, they may not be able to recoup those additional costs. And then finally, on the labor side, closer to home here in Los Angeles, in the back end of May, we did a study along with Aveen Sharma here at the Port of LA over about 25 labor shifts for the dock workers. And what we saw is for every 2 longshore members that walked into the hiring hall, 1 went home without work. This has hit us right here at the Port of LA. So what's next? We've got 2 key milestone dates upcoming. August 11th is the end of that 90-day pause period between the United States and China on their negotiations. And for the rest of the world, save Canada and Mexico, July the 8th is right around the corner for us. Now, we did hear Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent yesterday state publicly that if they're in good faith negotiations and there is progress with trading nations at the table, they may extend those dates. Well, once again, that adds to the complexity that we're all trying to deal with. More than 60 announcements on trade and tariffs have emanated from Washington since January. What I'm told from everyone around and what matches up with our thinking here at the Port of Los Angeles, we need long-term comprehensive trade agreements. These are framework deals that will be announced at some point. We've only had one to date between the U.S. and the U.K. We don't have a lot of details just yet. Until then, this notion of uncertainty and confusion for businesses, consumers, and the workforce alike will continue.
Gene, thanks for that insightful assessment. It serves as a perfect transition to today's guest. Could you please introduce him?
My pleasure, Philip. Prior to his current role, Ernie Tedeschi served as the chief economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Now, as the director of economics at the Budget Lab at Yale, Ernie leads a team that analyzes how federal policies like tariffs impact Americans and the economy. Ernie joins us today from Silver Spring, Maryland. Good afternoon, Ernie.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Ernie, let's jump right in. You're closely monitoring the fast-changing tariff landscape. Can you give us an overview of the Budget Lab's work, along with your perspective on this week's developments regarding U.S.-China trade?
Absolutely. So let's start with my first slide, which gives some summary statistics. Tariffs to date announced in 2025 raised the average effective tariff rate in the United States by an additional 12 percentage points. So to translate that into consumer impacts, On average, for American families, that's an increase in prices of 1.5%, which may take time to fully bake in, may take a year or two. That 1.5% would lower purchasing power for the average American family by $2,500 per family per year in 2024 dollars. So that's a substantial amount. As you might imagine, not every American family feels the pinch of that average. Tariffs are a regressive tax. That means that they hurt lower and working class families more than they do higher income families. So I told you that the average reduction in purchasing power was 1.5% for each family. But for at the very bottom of the income scale, that pinch is 2.5% versus at the very top where it's only 1%. So much larger decline at the bottom for them. In terms of the macro economy, we see the tariffs announced to date as shaving 0.5 point off of real GDP growth in 2025. So if you were at 2%, you would now be at 1.5%. I think that that's a floor, not a midpoint or a ceiling, because in addition to the direct effects of tariffs, there are, of course, uncertainty effects from tariffs. So consumers and businesses who don't know what tariff policy will be at the end of this press conference, let alone a week, a month, an hour from now, sitting on their hands and not making all of the long-run purchasing, investment, and hiring decisions that they would otherwise make if they had certainty about what policy would be. That 0.5 point off of GDP growth this year, by the way, translates into 376,000 fewer jobs by the end of the year, and an unemployment rate that's roughly 0.3 percentage points higher. As you might also imagine, the impact is going to be different on different products. So it's not 1.5% increase in prices for everything across the board. Products that Americans are more likely to import are going to be pinched much more than other products. So in particular, products like leather goods, things like shoes and handbags, products like apparel, products like consumer electronics, we believe will all see double-digit price increases in the short run over the next year or two. For leather products, we estimate price increases of 30%. For apparel, 28%. For textiles, 15% as a result of these tariffs. And what's interesting is that even in the long run, say 10 years out, after global supply chains have a chance to reoptimize, after businesses and consumers make tough decisions about whether they're going to buy an import, whether they're going to buy a domestic good, when there's some chance for production to shift globally to reoptimize around the tariffs, we still see persistent price increases in these products in the long run, 17% for leather products, 15% for apparel. So even after the economy, consumers and businesses have a chance to react, that is not going to be able to mitigate all of the price increase. The final thing I would say, and if you could go to the next slide, please. So I mentioned at the beginning that 2025 policy would be an increase in the average effective tariff rate of 12 percentage points. So that would bring the all-in rate to somewhere around 15%. That is the highest average effective tariff rate for the United States since 1938, the days of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the middle of the Great Depression. So this is a significant increase in the average tariff rate for Americans, for consumers, for businesses. That is unprecedented since the days of the Great Depression, much, much higher than we saw in President Trump's first term and under President Biden. So this is a whole other ballgame in terms of tariff policy for the United States.
Thanks, Ernie. We've been talking about this for some time now because we focus on public policy. We've got that upstream look to manufacturing and orders that take a long time through an order cycle process. But the inflation numbers that came out this week look pretty unimpacted by these tariffs and the policies. What do you make of that?
So it doesn't surprise me for a number of different reasons. Number one is that we know it takes time for tariffs to flow through to the official data. So the example I always give is in 2018, the then first Trump administration placed tariffs on imported washing machines in January of 2018. we didn't see an effect on the washing machine CPI data, the prices that consumers were actually seeing, until April of 2018, 3 months later. The main reason why that is because retailers had a large inventory of pre-tariff washing machines that they burned through first. Those were the prices that consumers were seeing at first. And it wasn't until that they went through that stock that they then shifted to importing washing machines from overseas that were tariffed at a higher rate, that they then passed those prices on to consumers. Probably in part for that is because there was uncertainty about whether these washing machine tariffs would stick. And so businesses, as you could understand, were being cautious. The other reason is that it takes time for these tariffs to go through. The other reason is that we know from government revenue data that the present tariffs that are being collected are not yet fully enforced yet. So like I said, we would expect a 12 percentage point increase in the average effective tariff rate if we're just looking at the policy that has been announced. We know from actual government revenue data that revenue is up, but it's only up about half of what we would expect. And again, there are all sorts of reasons for that. We know that there were delays with CBP collecting tariffs in certain contexts at certain ports. It is very tough to enforce this closure of the de minimis loophole, for example, especially from goods coming in from China. And probably consumers and businesses in the very short run this month are being strategic about what they're importing now that they know that tariffs are in effect. And so it may not be flowing through yet to the government revenue data or to the CPI data. One of the best data sources I look at is done by a Harvard professor named Alberto Cavallo with his co-authors who take in daily price data from large American retailers who are online, like Amazon, for example. And we know from actual online price data that prices for inputs have been rising. When you look at affected products, that is, products that we know have tariffs placed on them, that are imported on online retailers like Amazon, Cavallo's work shows that prices for those affected imports have risen by nearly 4% since early March. When you look even at affected products that are domestic in origin, so they are made in the USA, their prices have increased by 1% since early March, which may sound surprising at first, but is not entirely surprising when you remember that even made in the USA products often use imported parts as inputs into the production process. And of course, those imported parts have tariffs levied on them as well. So businesses naturally will pass through those prices to consumers eventually as well.
Thanks, Ernie. And we tend to gravitate a lot to the import discussion, but the export market here in Los Angeles, as I mentioned, was down 6 consecutive months. What are you seeing with respect to the retaliatory tariffs from other trading partners on the U.S. export market?
Yeah, so we expect that exports as a result of retaliatory tariffs that have been placed on the U.S. so far will reduce U.S. real exports. So think of that as export volumes by 14% in the end. And we're seeing data so far on a monthly basis that's consistent with eventually getting to that type of effect. As a reminder, China has retaliatory tariffs of 10 and 15% on different items right now. Canada has a broad list ranging between 10 to 25% on American exports. And the EU is considering their own tariff list that is not yet fully in effect, but may go into effect depending on how negotiations with the EU go as well. If those EU retaliatory tariffs came into effect, I would probably revise up that 14% real export impact for American manufacturers, because then the hit would be even more. The one saving grace for exporters so far has been that the dollar has, if anything, weakened since tariffs went into effect, not strengthened. Your economics textbook tells you that the dollar goes up in value as a result of tariffs, and that's probably in effect a pressure that's happening. But overall, the dollar has weakened, probably because people in the currency markets are weighing the upward effect of tariffs, but then weighing them against the weakening U.S. economic outlook. And the weakening U.S. economic outlook is winning out right now. So, so a sliver of good news for exporters in that the dollar is not strengthening quite as much as we would have expected, but it's for very bad reasons, right? Which is that the U.S. is now weaker economically to investors than they thought before.
Great points. Let's shift now over to small and medium-sized businesses broadly, Ernie. As you know, we have about 125,000 companies that call Los Angeles home on the import side of the business. And there's only a handful of big guys, because nobody has more than a 5% share. So this distribution of cargo is pretty flat across the board. And it's these small to middle-sized folks that I'm hearing from on a regular basis about how these tariff impacts hit them right away on the choice of buying at elevated prices and wondering if they cannot pass on those costs because they'll be uncompetitive with the big guys. Where do they sit? They're really in the crosshairs right now. What's your take on what the research shows at this point?
So I would say that anybody giving solid advice to or confident advice to small businesses is giving bad advice right now, because it is so uncertain what the right call is for small and medium-sized businesses. And I think that is the main thing that they are struggling with, is they don't know when to pull the trigger on buying inventory for the holiday season. Is now the optimal time? Do they wait a little bit longer to see if there's a lower China rate? I know that there's been a China deal announced this week, but I think confidence is still low that that's going to be the persistent China rate, that the administration couldn't just out of nowhere announce a new set of tensions with China or a new deal with China that lowers the rate even further. I mean, there is two-sided risk here for small and medium-sized businesses. And it's particularly hard for them because they lack the negotiating power or the contract power that bigger businesses do. So the small and medium-sized businesses are often price takers when it comes to imports and just, lack the leverage to be able to negotiate lower prices the way some of the larger players do here. I would say, too, that for small and medium-sized businesses, other sources of uncertainty are that, as you said earlier, we've only announced one, anywhere near comprehensive trade deal so far, and that's been with the UK, incidentally, a country with whom we had a trade surplus. So for an importer, not even necessarily the biggest market. And we are waiting on much larger shares of U.S. imports, including the EU, Japan, and Vietnam. Deals with them, potential deals with them, are very important to the way that small and medium-sized businesses are going to plan. And it's very unclear where those negotiations will end up. And then you layer on top of all of that uncertainty the court cases that are working their way. And the possibility, again, it's two-sided, that on the one hand, the Supreme Court, and I think it's very clear at this point that the tariff legal challenges are going to end up in the Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court could invalidate some or all of the emergency tariffs that this administration has played, or they might not. They might completely validate them. And even if they invalidate them, there are some other temporary authorities that the administration could draw on for some time, 5 months, for example, of up to 15% tariffs on all countries before then Congress would have to approve. That would extend the uncertainty even further. And we're probably not even going to get a Supreme Court case until this fall. So in a funny way, the legal challenges that are working out that initially invalidated the tariffs and then that decision was stayed, if anything, extend the period of uncertainty for small and medium-sized businesses. And it's very hard to navigate that and know optimally what to do.
Thanks, Ernie. A lot of coverage there. One last question from my side. With respect to the federal budget bill that is making its way through Congress with a lot of discussion, we've heard about tariffs and the collections of those tariffs, downsizing staffing at federal agencies, taking a look at federal expenditures, and then extending those 2017 tax cuts. How does all this come together, inclusive of tariffs, when we talk about that budget bill?
Yeah, great question. So the administration talks about these two things in tandem, both the tax bill on the one side and tariffs on the other side. They're framing tariffs as a pay for or a way of offsetting the deficit effects of the tax bill working its way through Congress right now. That's with the Senate. So if we could go to the last slide, this is brand new research that the Budget Lab has put out that combines the distributional effects of both the tax bill as it was passed by the House, that's not what the final one is going to be, and the distributional effects of tariffs. So you remember that I said earlier that tariffs are a regressive tax. They pinch more at the bottom than they do at the top. The tax bill is also regressive in the sense that the tax benefits that are in the bill, net of what they've paid for within the bill by cutting things like Medicaid and food stamps, pinched at the bottom, but then gave some benefits to people at the top. When you net out the two things together, the tax bill and the tariff bill, on the one hand, tariffs raise $2.4 trillion over 10 years, assuming they stay in place. This tax bill costs $2.4 trillion. So those two things offset one another in a deficit sense. They don't offset one another in terms of the effect on American families, as this chart shows. The bottom 80% of Americans, on average, see a net loss from both the tariffs and even if you net out some of the benefits from the tax bill, their income is lower as a result of the two things together. And Americans in the 80 to 90th percentile, that ninth decile, they're basically close to neutral. I think when we converted this chart into dollar terms, they see an $80 net benefit per year. So very close to zero. It's only Americans making above $500,000, those Americans in the top decile by income, that as a result of these two bills see a very clear net benefit. So in other words, tariffs do offset the deficit effect of the tax bill as it stands right now through Congress, so no deficit effect, but not nearly close to a neutral effect when it comes to the actual effect on income for American families.
Thanks, Ernie. It's interesting, too, because we talk about this is not a transactional type discussion. From the way retailers think about us as consumers buying into the future to how factories have to plan those parts and components coming in. Recently, the Atlanta Fed did a survey of businesses asking one specific question. Do you think you can pass on the cost of tariffs to your customer or your consumer? 50% right off the top said yes, that's what we're going to do. So this impact, not seen yet, pretty much around the corner from what many experts are saying. Well, thanks for all that insight. I know we have a number of questions from the media lined up already. Let's turn it back over to Philip.
Thank you both. Yes, we do have a number of questions, and we'll get to all of those. And if anyone's got one, please enter it in the Q&A box below and include your name and affiliation. First question, Ernie. Are the tariffs leading the U.S. into an economic recession? Received that from a couple of reporters.
So I want to be very sober here and clear-eyed. We have an economic model that says this will shave 50 basis points off of growth in 2025. That is a major headwind to growth. That is beyond, say, a hurricane or any kind of usual shock that would affect the American economy in a given year. On the other hand, let's be equally clear that if you thought that growth in the United States was going to be 2% this year, which is what economists generally think trend growth is going to be, and you shave off half a point, you're at 1.5. That's not great. That's not negative either, however. That's not literally on its face a recession. And people need to keep in mind that there is a vast economic purgatory between good and recessionary. There's a lot of bad but not recessionary in between. And so there is a decent chance that tariffs could be within that middle ground. However, the last thing I'll say, just because I'm an economist and so I'm a dismal scientist by definition, remember what I said before, that our half a point impact is, if anything, a floor, not a ceiling. We're not fully incorporating the effect on business investment and consumer spending from the uncertainty around these tariffs. And in particular, the way that these tariffs specifically this year have been rolled out, with it being, quite unknown what the final rate is going to be, an announcement made one day that is then reversed or contradicted the next day. That has to affect business decisions and consumer decisions in some way that is very hard to capture in an economic model. And so the risk around that 50 basis points that I mentioned is for that damage to be greater than what we're saying, not less than what we're saying. And once you get above, say, a percentage point, now you're starting to get into territory that could very well be recessionary in the short.
Thank you. Next question is from Jose Herrera, City News Service. He's asking, regarding the U.S.-China ongoing trade discussions, what's the best case scenario that could develop beyond the announcement from earlier in the week? Ernie?
So the announcement earlier in the week seems to be cementing in sort of the pause status quo, the idea that we would have 25% commodity tariffs on China on top of this 30%, fentanyl IEEPA tariff on all Chinese imports. Look, the president had talked about increasing the IEEPA fentanyl tariff on China to 60% before, during the campaign and earlier this year. So on the one hand, that 30% is certainly lower than it was, definitely lower than the 125% where we were earlier in the year. Is there obviously, though, that rate can go lower. I see the prospect of that as very low. Even as we have given ground on tariff rates with other countries like Canada, Mexico, to a certain extent with the UK, we have not been giving much ground on our tariff rates with China. I think because that is the ultimate focus of this administration is, they're willing to make deals with other trading partners, but they want to isolate China in some way. All of that said, never say never. There is a non-zero chance that we come to some sort of further arrangement with China that lowers that rate even further than 30%. That's definitely the best case scenario. That's not my optimistic or modal case right now. I think that the risk around China tariffs is that they end up being higher than they are right now because of some trade dispute that erupts within the next year, because of some, some conflict that the administration raises with China, rather than them being lower than they are right now.
Thank you, Ernie. Gene, thoughts on this?
Yeah, Jose, great question. I think from where we sit at the Port of Los Angeles, the best case scenario for us would be finding a way for the world's two largest economies to work together. And we've said often that rules-based trade is an American imperative to protect jobs and iconic brands and help us grow our economy. But it's not simply one lever that we can pull. 70% of this U.S. economy is you and me out there buying at the retail level. That's got to be considered here too. And all said and done, buying products out of China right now still costs 1.5 times more than it did earlier this year, making products of all types extremely expensive and creating a decision platform for companies that not necessarily is going to be in our best interest as consumers. We'll likely see lower inventories, fewer selections on store shelves, and higher prices in some cases. Now, it's true that products and sourcing of those will migrate to Southeast Asia and other locations, but I'll give you this example. For that shirt that is now tariffed at 55% coming out of China, I will bet you that the manufacturing facility in Vietnam knows exactly what those price points are, and even though they're operating under a 10% tariff, they're not going to have a deep discount compared to what the cost of that product coming out of China is today for the American importer. So their prices will likely rise higher than the mathematical formula attached to the 10% tariff. Prices go up across the board. Same concept with those steel tariffs. As we're here looking at the scorched areas following the wildfires in Altadena, Pacific Palisades, and Malibu, developers are telling me directly that the price to rebuild these homes and businesses is skyrocketing. We need softwood lumber and appliances, just like Ernie talked about. Metal, steel, aluminum, copper, all those prices have gone up. Those steel tariffs at 50% mean that U.S. companies can raise their prices higher, making it more expensive for all of us. So this is a really delicate balance here that we're talking about. Prices rise no matter what location we're in as a result of tariffs in one specific segment. A lot more work to do here. Thanks, Jose. Good having you with us again this month.
Thank you both. Gene, this question is for you. It's from Laura Curtis of Bloomberg and Isabel Sami from LA Business First. As federal immigration enforcement activity continues in Southern California, is the port concerned about any losses in its workforce? And is the port providing support to its workers and the larger community who may be impacted?
Thanks for the question, Laura and Isabel. Yes, I am concerned about the workforce and their families, but I'm concerned about people in general with what we've witnessed over the last 8 days. Our supply chain is vast. From farms to factories and everywhere in between, we need to keep this economic engine running, and that takes people. The institutional knowledge that we have here in this Southern California gateway is unrivaled anywhere in the world. We've all heard from Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass and California Governor Gavin Newsom this week. They've pledged to make services available at the state and local level, as have many organizations to help those who have been impacted. Here at the Port of Los Angeles, we'll continue to support those efforts in any way we can, putting people first. Thanks for the question.
Ernie, from Lorianne Larocco of CNBC. Have you quantified the impact that tariffs are having on small businesses? And separately, where do you see inflation year over year as a result of the tariffs?
Right. So we haven't specifically quantified the effect on small businesses. I would point out that small businesses make up the vast majority of employment in the United States. So to the extent that there are labor market effects, output effects that we've projected in aggregate, those are likely to hit small businesses disproportionately to other businesses. One of the other mechanisms there, remember, is that large businesses, like I was talking about before, have some amount of leverage with suppliers in, being able to, at least in the short run, negotiate perhaps some relief from tariffs, or not fully realizing the cost increase from tariffs, whereas small and medium businesses are price takers when it comes to global supply chains. They don't have that leverage. And so the full amount of, so they are going to face the full amount of tariffs and will have to either eat or pass on the full amount of tariffs, as a result of what's been done so far. And then I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
The second part was, where do you see inflation year over year as a result of tariffs?
Right. So we ultimately see a 1.5% price level increase as a result of the tariffs that have been put in place so far. I see that as taking 2 or 3 years to fully realize. So I would probably be at roughly 0.5 point extra inflation this year, next year, and the year after, maybe a little bit more on the front end and a little bit less on the back end. But I think this will take time. One thing that I point out to people is that one of the biggest modern tariff increases in American history, the Smoot-Hawley tariff that was introduced in 1930, it took 3 years before even the Smoot-Hawley tariff was fully baked into American policy. It wasn't until 1933 that we reached peak tariff policy under that. And I think similarly, it's going to take some time for us to fully incorporate these tariff costs, both in terms of what consumers and businesses face, and then in terms of the economic data.
Great, thanks, Ernie. Gene, from Bill Mongaluzzo, Journal of Commerce. The port's forecast for imports on the signal looks strong the next few weeks. How long do you anticipate they'll remain elevated? And When they decline, will it be a drop steep?
Thanks for joining as always, Bill. You're referring to the next couple of weeks on the Port Optimizer, where we see about 122,000 TEUs of imports coming in next week, and then about 124,000 the week after that. This week, particularly slow, although we do have 12 ships at the Port of LA today, which is a good number for this time of year. The numbers you're referring to, Bill, are pretty average for where we should be in the month of June, leaning in towards peak season. They are compared to a pretty weak start to June last year. Take that away. Compared to run rates, they're about on target with where they need to be. And this matches up with what we had begun talking about last month. During the weekend of the Geneva meetings, if we reach some sort of an accord to pull down from those 145% import tariffs out of China, we would likely see importers go back in and scoop up product that had already been manufactured to live up to the contracts on purchase orders that were already in motion. But we didn't see too many new purchase orders going in on the retail side of the business. We also said that it would take a couple of weeks for the liner shipping companies to reposition their vessels at key ports in China from Qingdao all the way down to Yantian. It's exactly what happened. 1 month later, we start to see that cargo picking up a little bit to more normal levels. And we're happy with that because that means more dock workers and truckers will be out on the job hauling this cargo. But I don't see the surge that some observers had called for. And that, again, has been reinforced by the announcement through Hackett and Associates, as well as the National Retail Federation, where retail business on the import side looks to be down year over year for the balance of the summer. We will see a little bit of a peak season in the month of July arrivals, trying to get ready for the all-important Christmas and year-end holiday season. But again, retailers are not telling me that they're boosting inventory levels to have wide selections on products beginning that Thanksgiving week and running to the end of the year. So I'm not seeing that either. But the parts suppliers, the tiered suppliers for OEMs back in Southeast Michigan, tell me that they keep moving that product into the factories to keep the lines running. But one OEM told me they've all but stopped finished vehicles from going to China because those retaliatory tariffs just make the cars too expensive. So there's a lot to digest here, but encouraged by this product. It's lining up with what we thought we would happen, so our dock workers are ready. They're going to be out on the job moving that cargo. Our velocity statistics that we look at in the Port Optimizer every single day and night are really good. We can accept that cargo. There's less than 30% of the cargo on the docks today than was at the peak of the peak during COVID. We got plenty of room to manage the cargo, the best workforce in the world, and the machinery has been tuned up over these last couple of weeks. Some preventative maintenance, getting the yards groomed to make sure that when we saw that cargo pick up again, the Port of Los Angeles would be ready. Thanks, Bill. I also don't have a real good outlook on how steep a drop would be, but we're going to keep watching these purchase orders, the loadings in Asia. We can see up to 40 days in advance from far-reaching locations in Southeast Asia, but I don't know that we're going to fall off a cliff because the American economy is still moving forward, albeit maybe not at the pace we would like. So let's watch this closely, but no dramatic effect up or down at the present time. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Next question is for Ernie. It's from Greg Miller of Lloyd's List. So, Ernie, you've talked about the inflationary effect of tariffs. What do you think about the broad effect of tariffs on containerized import demand? To what degree could this be a medium or long-term negative factor for import demand to the extent tariffs cannot be passed along to consumers?
Right. So in our projections, we see volumized import demand falling by 14% in the medium term. So that's say 3 to 5 years out. Again, on a month-to-month basis, in terms of the import numbers that we've seen so far, seems very consistent with that, even potentially greater than that in the short run. So, I think it's definitely going to have an effect on import demand. China, as of 2024, made up 14% of imports. We have China share of imports coming down over the next several years. A logical consequence of having 55% tariffs right, on Chinese goods coming in. Consumers and businesses are going to try to find alternatives from Chinese imports. What I think we have to keep in mind, though, is number one, not all of these industries are going to be able to reshore for consumers and businesses to be able to avoid tariffs. So let's take apparel, for example. We have very little apparel reshoring happening as a result of these tariffs, because even given the cost increase imposed by these tariffs, it's still not economical in most cases to do apparel manufacturing in the United States, given our one might say labor costs, but someone else might say because of our quality, our standard of living here, it's still not economical to do it in the United States. So consumers and businesses, even if they switch from China to another country as the source of, say, apparel or shoes or electronics imports, are still going to end up eating a lot of those tariffs, not being able to buy them here. The second thing is that even domestic products are not a surefire way to avoid cost increases from tariffs. I always bring up the example of the 2018 increase in washing machine tariffs. Well, domestic manufacturers of washing machines who were not exposed to those tariffs ended up raising their prices as a result of the tariffs as well by nearly the full amount of the tariff that was placed on imports. Why did they do that? Some of it was due to the tariffs affecting their inputs into production, but most of it was just actually due to a logical business effect. Their number one competitor saw an unavoidable price increase, and so what did the domestic manufacturers do? They raised their prices. It's what probably any business would do in a competitive environment, is they took advantage of these tariffs and raised their prices. What that did, though, was it meant that you as an American business or you as an American consumer didn't have the choice between an imported or domestic source of washing machine as a way to avoid this price increase. The price increase was across the board.
Very good. Thank you. We've got about 7 or 8 more minutes for questions. We'll try to get a bunch in, and we'll kind of run through these. Gene, Justin McCowan, infrastructure investor. Are the tariffs and slowdown in cargo impacting the port's ability to invest in infrastructure projects?
Thanks, Justin. In short, no. For the last 10 years, our strong financial policy has allowed us to increase cash holdings, pay down debt, and get us in a position to continue this strong investment. What I see now is if cargo volume stays lower or becomes even more depressed, that might give us the opportunity to accelerate these projects and get them to completion. There'll be a day that this all settles out into some type of view that we can plan a little bit longer term, and so let's use this opportunity to get there. Investments on rail, terminals, road connectors, and bridges will all continue at fast speed. Dina Arian-Zalen, who runs our development bureau, has a $2.5 billion capital plan over the next decade, and we want to keep those 3,500 construction workers on the job every day. I like our chances here because of the planning we've done for the past 10 years. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Gene. FreightWaves, Stuart Churls asks, what are the container carriers saying in light of Israel's attacks on Iran as far as the effect on Mideast shipping routes and plans going forward?
Well, Stuart, it adds even more complexity, and our thoughts obviously are with the crew who's managing these vessels and make sure that they have safe passage everywhere they go. Majority of carriers are still going around the Cape of Good Hope, avoiding the Red Sea, avoiding the Suez Canal. And what we've seen with prices on oil spike overnight, that's a consideration too for the liner shipping companies with respect to the bunker fuel and other products that they use for those ships. So everybody in this industry will be monitoring that situation very closely, and one more variable in this deep equation of complexity. Thank you.
Thank you. Question for Ernie from Isa Fleischman of Bloomberg. The U.S. Treasury brought in a record $23 billion in customs duties in May. Are you able to track the tariffs paid by importers broken down by tariff authority, fentanyl, Section 301, for example?
Yes. So DHS has that data, the Department of Homeland Security. I don't have that available to me right here. But if you go to Customs and Border Patrol, they should have, with some amount of lag, I think it's 2 months lag, they should have all of that broken down. The other point I'll make is that that 22 billion that we raised in May last month, like I was saying before, that 22 billion translates into an average effective tariff rate of roughly 7.5% to 8%. So definitely higher than where we were at the beginning of the year when we were at 2.5%. But remember what I said earlier, that we expect that policy right now is the equivalent of a 15.5% average effective tariff rate all in, both, including the new announcements in 2025 and where we were prior. So if, we're expecting 15.5%, but we're only at between 7.5% to 8%, we're only about halfway to, full strength, fully baked in tariffs so far in the United States, given what's been announced so far.
Thanks, Ernie. Gene from California Insider and Epoch Times, Ryan Dang. Can you share your thoughts regarding how these tariffs are affecting the industry here in LA, particularly the trucking jobs here in Los Angeles?
Yeah, Ryan, thanks for joining. If you're a trucker who was hauling 4 or 5 containers a day prior to these announcements back in April, today you're likely hauling 2 or 3 loads. Now, again, it's a pretty fluid situation, but for the month of May, with 17 canceled sailings amounting to about 225,000 container units that we had planned on receiving didn't show up. So there's less work on the docks. And as I mentioned earlier, I outlined about 2 weeks worth of work for our ILW dock workers. And all of those averages of dayside and nightside work during the week and the weekends were all combined. And for every 2 dock workers that went into the hiring hall, 1 went home without a job that day. So the impact is seen clearly and visibly right here on the docks in Los Angeles. That's why we're happy to see a 12 ship day, and it's one of the very few double-digit ship days we've had in weeks. Same thing can be said with the strength of the number of work gangs that are out on the docks today. This is a little bit of an outlier, but we'll take it. We want these folks on the job every day. Thanks, Ryan.
We're going to try to get 3 more questions in here in the next couple of minutes. Gene, Scott Horsley, NPR. Did the import volumes increase at all between early May and late May after the triple-digit tariffs were temporarily paused?
Yeah, a little bit, and exactly what I said earlier, that the initial shock of those 145% tariffs that were announced, many importers just simply slammed on the brakes and halted any movement of cargo. Now, you still saw some cargo coming out of China, but here's the other example. In a given week during the month of May, we usually welcome about 20 ships. There were most weeks where 4 of those ships were canceled, and those were the nonstop services out of China, the workhorse vessels, directly to Los Angeles. So we took the hit right away. Then coming out of the Geneva talks, where it was stated publicly tariffs would drop from 145 to 30%. That 30% was an average of averages and didn't necessarily take into effect the cumulative outcome of layering all of those tariffs, as Ernie has covered here today, making the products much more expensive. So you saw a lot of parts and components for American factories, albeit lower levels of volume than normal, still going to these factories nationwide to keep those plants running. You saw fewer containers coming in for American retailers, big and small. The sum result is that our cargo was down 19% compared to the month of April, as we typically see May ramping in to these seasonal products and the all-important peak season. So the impact was seen, and we've started to slice that data in a number of ways to make sense of it and to understand how we have to prepare for what's coming next.
Thank you, Gene. Ernie, from Maritime freelance reporter Eric Watkins, you recently wrote that consumers are trying to front-run tariffs, increasing purchases before they go into effect. Can you maybe give one example and where we are in that cycle right now?
Sure. So we see this in the aggregate data. So if you look at real durables spending, so think of that as volumes of durable spending. In November and December of last year, the month-to-month increase in real durable spending surged to 2% both of those months. That's quite a robust monthly increase in real durable spending. And then in January, the next month, that plunged by 4%. So you had 2 months of very strong real durable spending before the beginning of the year that immediately went negative in January of this year. When you look at consumer surveys, when you look at consumer sentiment data, it's very clear that the main thing driving that shift in durables was anticipation of tariffs. Consumers were trying to get ahead in late last year of any possible tariff changes. And when January came, they stopped purchasing this month. Now, that recovered a little bit in the data. In March, we saw a surge of nearly 4% in real durable spending. But then in April, it turned negative again to almost negative 1%. So we're seeing this sort of seesaw pattern in the consumer spending data, where when there's some relief on the tariff side or some uncertainty, consumers seem to be trying to front run the tariffs, trying to get ahead or take advantage of what seem to be lulls in policy. But then when tariffs go in effect, the next month, as in, say, April of this year, consumer spending then stops.
Great. Thanks so much, Ernie. Gene, last question. Have you had any recent contact with the White House or in the administration? And if so, what is your message?
Yes, as I've shared, I sit on an advisory committee for the United States Trade Representative. We meet regularly and talk about these active negotiations with trading partners around the world. I try to give the ground truth, and as I've said here before, I have to be apolitical in my job. I've got to work with everybody. My job is to increase the cargo flows that run American businesses and help our trading partners support us. So with that, I've continued to share what we look like from the employment base to the cargo flows and the impacts on the service providers, the more than 9,000 companies here in Southern California that move all this cargo, and what I'm hearing directly from the companies that we serve. There, in addition to the 125,000 importing companies, there are about another 75,000 companies that use the Port of Los Angeles annually for their exports. So we have a wide sample size of folks and their experiences that we continue to relate back to Washington. Super helpful on my end as we're learning more and more every day, and I plan to keep sharing this advice with the decision and policymakers back in the nation's capital. Thank you.
Thank you both for all those great answers. Gene, that concludes our media questions for today. Back to you for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Philip. Ernie, that was great. Good discussion, a lot of work that the Budget Lab is doing. We're going to keep an eye out for your updates, and I'm told that we had a good turnout from the media today, which just continues to underscore the importance of this dialogue as open and as frequent as we can bring it to America and those who are watching around the world. So thanks for taking out time on a Friday, Ernie.
It's my pleasure. As a native Southern Californian, it was my pleasure to join.
Awesome. Have a good weekend, and we'll be talking soon.
You too.
In closing, I'd like to share some exciting news about the growing cruise industry here at the Port of Los Angeles. A few weeks ago, we were thrilled to welcome Royal Caribbean Line's Ovation of the Seas, the largest vessel ever to be home ported here. This beautiful ship can accommodate more than 4,900 guests and has a crew of up to 1,500 staff. With more than 2,000 staterooms and 14 passenger decks, the Ovation is one of Royal Caribbean's standout ships, known for being part of the world's largest fleet of luxury liners. Previously home ported in Sydney, Hong Kong, and Seattle, the Ovation is now part of Royal Caribbean's expansion into Southern California. They're offering weekly sailings to ports including Cabo San Lucas, Ensenada, and nearby Catalina Island. This arrival strengthens our long-standing partnership with Royal Caribbean and helps pave the way for our plans to build a new state-of-the-art outer harbor cruise terminal. The Ovation of the Seas enhances the cruise options for millions of Southern Californians who are just a short drive away from the port. It also offers convenient access for out-of-town visitors arriving at Los Angeles International Airport. As I've noted before, cruising represents an important line of business at the port and translates into big economic benefits for our communities. Each cruise call in Los Angeles generates more than $1.2 million in local business activity. This year, we expect 240 cruise calls. With that, we'll likely exceed the record 1.3 million passengers that came through the World Cruise Terminal just 2 years ago. And finally, the Ovation to the Seas provides yet another compelling reason to visit our LA waterfront. We're excited to show visitors from around the globe what this $1 billion public access investment looks like up close. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you back here again in July.